Hey
you?
guys.
I am so pleased to see you that you've joined us, Paul and Dr. Lopez, who's let me call him Carlos. I feel honored to be with such an outstanding
Paul as
panel
well.
today.
How's it going?
Fantastic. Kigali is beautiful. We even saw the sun come out, which is amazing for this time of year.
That is
And
nice.
we have intensive competition at the AGRF this year. As you probably know, at the present moment, going on real time is a ministerial roundtable and as well a youth town hall. So we have to be exciting and dynamic and rile the troops on what I think is the most exciting topic of this AGRF this week, which is about the regional food trade opportunities, both for governments and for businesses. And I think that we have a fantastic lineup of business leaders, decision makers, and policy makers. We hope really to delve into in this session, roll up our sleeves and talk about the likelihoods, risks, opportunities coming out of COVID, building back better, and the specific challenges with regard to regional integration. Increasing the markets is, I think, an imperative, and we can delve into the risks, the trade-offs, and how smallholder farmers can also be better consumers, have access to nutritional, healthy foods, just like urban markets. So with us today, I'm pleased and honored to start by introducing Mr. Paul Pullman, co-founder of and chair of Imagine, but also notoriously the former CEO of Unilever. And we are so pleased that you made the time to join us. And I can say that you've been working probably harder in the last few months than you thought after you retired from Unilever. But if you don't mind, just give us your perspective to kick us off, Paul. What can we really expect as the opportunity in an integrated African market, and how do you envision where we can go? And you're welcome to introduce yourself or just dive into the topic.
Well, I'll dive in right away. That is probably the most useful. And thank you, Vanessa, for the opportunity to speak at this important Markets and Trade Symposium. Also, thanks to President Kagame. I'm happy it's again in Kigali, a beautiful city, and again, playing an important role in Africa to build that continent further. I personally could not think of a more important topic to talk about today. International trade, without any doubt, has been recognized by the UN as an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction. But I also think that it is an important means to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Trade facilitation can reduce costs, increase opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, and spark this competitiveness and this productivity, this innovation, and this growth that you so eloquently talked about in the introduction. Now, food security and food supply runs, I believe, through all of the SDGs. There is not one of the 17 SDGs that is not affected by getting us into a good food system. Hence the importance of what AGRA is doing and what you're talking about today. There's no question that COVID, the pandemic that we sadly are dealing with today, is resulting not only in an economic crisis, but it has also made us realize that we have to do a better job to managing risks. It threatens lives, livelihoods, food security, and frankly, the prosperity of future generations. Now, it includes managing the spreads of diseases, but also applies to dealing with the runaway land and natural resource degradation that we're seeing. And food security is a big part of that. Climate change is obviously a part of that, and as well as rising inequality. So it's all interrelated, and the topic is more than urgent. As devastating as COVID is, I also think that the pandemic, as you rightfully said, has given us an opportunity to reset a broken system that is frankly neither working for people nor for planet. And we should adjust the trading rules and norms accordingly to build back better. And the African AFTA, whatever you call it, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, we should have thought of a little simpler name, is an important part of that to make that work. Not only to make Africa self-sufficient, but also to become a major exporter. It has always hurt me on any of these visits that Africa is still importing food, and when it produces or exports, it barely captures any of the value that is in the value chain. So as we design for success, it is key that we design it right. And one of the ways to do that and design it right is to do that within our planetary boundaries. Our land is degraded, our food system is broken. It's a major contributor to climate change. And actually, most people in the food chain are still on the bottom of the pyramid in poverty. And these are the smallholder farmers. So as we develop better, we need to design sustainable food systems, which would be my first message, and fill the many cracks that we see now. The rules and norms of international trade will have a decisive impact on the global environment or the economic equity and the food security. And that's why it's so important that you get this trade agreement to work. The expansion of global production and trade actually right now has devastated the vital ecosystems in some parts of the world. In fact, 1.6 billion people in this world rely directly on the world's forests for food, income, and livelihoods. And as we have seen in many places, it is actually the destruction of these forests that drives this fragmentation and degradation that has put these people's livelihoods at risk. We don't want to make that mistake in Africa. The pandemic has also had an impact on the flow of food across the world. It has shining a spotlight really on the need for improving our food supply, our food security, if you want to, or sustainability of our global commodity supply chains. And that is not over yet. We've seen enormous transport and labor disruptions that are impeding the free flow of food products and frankly compromising the ability to feed the world's population. And that risk is only going up, especially in some of the lower income countries in your region. That would be, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the global shocks that we see make food more expensive in the poorer countries especially. I remember just a few months ago in Nigeria to see the grain or the rice prices go up 30% just as a result of this disruption in the value chain. And the final point is obviously on climate and inequality. On climate, agriculture is a major contributor to climate change. We think that about 23% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from a broken food system, if you want to. And in East Africa, people are actually paying, especially the poor people once more, a price not only for climate change, that also has given us the locusts, but it's also given us the COVID. So it's a triple whammy that we're now seeing coming in, what many people call this multiplier effect. And then the final point, for which I'm absolutely the most passionate and actually the most important point, is it drives inequality. We've seen that COVID hits the poorest, or the poorest countries are the most vulnerable people hardest. And that is really, again, a evidence of the shortcomings of our economic system that seem to work for few people, but not for the many. The economic fallouts of this pandemic is probably likely to put 70 to 100 million people back into poverty. Many of them are in Africa. 130 to 140 million people could be pushed on the brink of starvation if you listen to the World Food Programme. So none of these crises that we see can be addressed alone. And obviously, a main part of helping solve this issue is the private sector. And I'll end there with a few words on the private sector, if I may, Vanessa, because what is very clear is that global governance currently is broken. We see a lack of global cooperation. We're willing to spend $12 trillion to stabilize these economies, basically in Europe and the US. And we have a hard time giving a penny to the emerging markets, recognizing that many of the issues that we're facing have originated in this part of the world. Now, the corporations, I think, are starting to wake up. They know that we must ensure safe and sustainable supply chains. They also know that a healthy environment is critical for the company's bottom lines. So that's why companies, I think, increasingly understand that they need to build these sustainable and resilient value chains. An ecosystem actually provides us $125 trillion worth of value. It's actually one of the biggest opportunities for Africa as well to generate income. And it employs now already 1.2 billion people. So it's not surprising that companies are waking up and want their value chains to be more resilient. We see major initiatives, for example, around cocoa in Ghana, Ivory Coast, and some of these places where Mars has pledged $1 billion to be sure we get sustainable chocolate. Unilever has just made an announcement, as a coincidence, also $1 billion to ensure that their whole value chain has sustainable sourcing. We have put a coalition together of 27 of the major food companies, as you're well aware, with the foundation I created called Imagine. And there, across the value chain, again, they're spending several billions of dollars to ensure that these value chains become more robust. And more robust also means for Africa that we involve the local companies. One of the biggest opportunities that we have, and probably the biggest wins in our value chain, is attacking the issues of food waste that affects everybody. And it can only be done if we work in these value chains together, not only with these big companies, but as you always have advocated and we're pushing for, increasingly also the smaller companies. The good thing is now that governments are waking up. Europe has the Green Deal. The UK has a very aggressive objective on deforestation with their COP26 presidency. China has now made commitments that they don't want to import materials that are unsustainable or linked to deforestation. And I hope that the words are being matched by the actions. So it means that Africa now has a wonderful opportunity to build their own food system in a more sustainable and equitable way. And this trade agreement that goes into force is a unique framework, I think, to start to leverage to make that possible.
Paul, you've run us from China to Africa through Europe and the US. And I think with that normal globetrotting vision of yours, enormous opportunities, as you've stated, a lot of the right things being said, a lot of good intentions. And yet when you talk to SMEs, as we do, and smallholder farmers, as we do on a regular basis, that inequality and the asymmetry is painful every day. Absolutely. And we know so well, and I was told not to say that Guinea Bissau is my favorite country in Africa, but I won't say that, but I have loved every minute of every trip to Guinea Bissau. Why? Because you feel like you're in the heart of Africa, really, when you go to Guinea Bissau. And I want to say that I learned about global supply chains through African cashew trees and trading markets globally. When we learned about 12, 15 years ago that in fact Africa was the largest producer of cashews, but the most hidden supplier. Everyone talks about cocoa, and you know, Paul, I like to challenge the status quo a bit, right? But with this rebellious panel that we have today, what can we do? Carlos, help us out from your bottom-up view and your experience also at UNECA and all of the work that you've done. What do you think we can really do in terms of moving the intentions and the fantastic leadership we've seen in the last few years around the African Continental Free Trade Area coming into force? How can we move this into an integrated regional food market and a more competitive market? Over to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for that touch on Guinea-Bissau. And it's really a pleasure to be with Paul. We both serve in the Global Commission on Economy and Climate that he is the co-chair. And I think that some of the things he has said, I can only confirm that these are opportunities for Africa, and these are also opportunities for the world. I think it's very important for us first to mention that the architecture of Africa's structural transformation goes beyond just the free trade area. We have been very busy in the continent, and I was very honored to be part of those efforts to put together first a vision, which is Agenda 2063, and from that vision derives a number of very important institutional policies, including the Continental Free Trade Area. And within the Continental Free Trade Area, there are a number of protocols that deal directly with some of the challenges that Paul has already identified. But I think it's very important for us to underline first, even before we get into the trade dimensions of this debate, that there are other dimensions that are equally important, like, for instance, everything to do with productive integration, everything that has to do with infrastructure integration, free movement of people, and obviously also the macroeconomic integration. So the continent has been in these 5 different tracks, trying to mutualize as much as possible its efforts, having more agency in the way we negotiate with the external world. I'm, for instance, helping in the negotiations with Europe, which is our #1 trading partner in terms of bloc. And it is very important for us to basically shift from a commodity-based export economy that is the one that generates public resources, but has been an impediment for us to structurally transform. It has been an impediment for industrialization in particular, into a more modern type of economy. I always like to underline the obvious. And the obvious is that industrialization is not only about manufacturing. It's about making sure that we are at the industrial age of production, meaning that we, more than anything else, formalize the economic exchanges. Because the informality of Africa is responsible for us not having the type of structure that public resources are supposed to incentivize, and when it comes to the social side, protect, and when it comes to creating opportunities for jobs, induce. And look at this reality. We have only 17 countries in Africa that have the national accounts up to date, which means that most of them live in the world of projections. And the reason they live in the world of projections, and it doesn't bother much people, it's because most of their resources and most of their economy, most of their GDP is calculated on the basis of their external relations with the rest of the world. Meaning it is trade that becomes so fundamental to generate resources, because you don't even bother to actually tax, for instance, economic activity in the country. And I'm not talking about taxing the informal. I'm talking about progressive taxation, obviously, taxing the informality of the rich, making sure that you don't have these disincentives for people to actually enter into a more modern setup, and for the country to actually rely more on its own internal resources. That's why we end up, with our pension funds having close to $1 trillion, and only about 20% of that is productively invested. The rest is there sitting, lying, and most of it, it's actually being used for corruption. It is being used in ways that are not serving the real transformation of the economies, because all our eyes are on these commodities and how we export them. Look at oil, for instance. And both Paul and I are concerned with fossil fuels, obviously. And you too, Vanessa. Look at oil. Oil is 40% of Africa's exports. 40%. Now, if we really depend on our trade for something like oil, look at the prices the way they are. It's like a wake-up call. COVID is telling us, look, you have to move. You have to adopt a different model. This is not going to work. Then you have these ecosystem issues that we have to address. I'm not going to elaborate on them, but perhaps we can go into details later in the discussion, that are all influencing the way we look into agriculture. And we have actually about $24 billion of intra-Africa agricultural exports. This is nothing compared to the potential. If we really want to look into agriculture as our way of industrializing, because we have, agro-processing is really absolutely fundamental avenue for us to respond to our demographics. There is no way we are going to be able to feed this level of urbanization that has no precedent in history, that we are going to be able to actually respond to the middle class that is growing, and it's going to use part of its disposable income first to feed better. without actually having regional value chains. And these regional value chains on agriculture are really a blessing for us also to make sure that our youth becomes more interested in the primary sector, because it's not going to be seen the old-fashioned way, subsistence level and so on. No, it's about productivity being introduced in a sector that is now, right now, with about 50% less yields than the rest of the world. This is absolutely essential transformation point for the continent. Because if you look into the debate right now, a lot of our leaders love to say, we have 60% of the unused arable lands. So be it. Our main problem is to use better what we already use. That, where there is so much waste, that there is no proper efficient use of the potential, let alone respectful of the environment and of the climate change imperatives that we have to face. So let's just translate all this discussion that we are having about climate into more than just adaptation. What is adaptation at the end of the day? It's a simplification. What we need is really a transformation that includes adaptation and other dimensions of the economic debate, such as how do we industrialize in a green way? Because there is a pathway that we can use for industrialization that will be based on latecomers advantage. Latecomers advantage is that if you have a deficit of infrastructure, don't put infrastructure now that you are building it up with old-fashioned technology and materials. You can do it in a sustainable way. If you are going to put factories and units of production, don't use the old technology. You have now agri-tech. You have immense possibilities to actually make it cleaner, with low carbon, and actually more efficient. If we need more power, and we are the continent with less power in terms of consumption, well, we are also one of the continents with the best renewable energy potential. So let's not do it the old-fashioned way. So these are the imperatives that we have to bring into the discussion that sometimes get lost if we just simplify adaptation and how much money are we going to get from development aid to do it.
I'm blown away by the visionary and willingness that you have, both of you, to really put everything back on the table. I'm so pleased to hear you say, Carlos, talking about using the land which is already under cultivation, for example, in a more productive way. I think we've all seen, for example, whether it be in cocoa, cashews, or even rice production, that farmers could be getting double, triple, even quadruple yields with better intensified use of inputs, improved, and of course, we're going to have Eric from Syngenta talking about this as well as Sadiq in the next section. And I also really appreciate, Paul, you're bringing up the issue of forestry as well and the threats to the forests. And this is a huge land issue as well. And Carlos, you also raised the question of infrastructure, right? And this is, and then use of local taxation. Simplification of climate issues is as difficult as it could be, but simplification of taxation and standardization of access for small businesses. So if I'm, a 15-year-old young woman today in Africa, and I look around me and I say, how can I contribute and drive? Or I'm 18 or 25 or any age whatsoever. How am I, as a youth entrepreneur, going to bring something better to my governments, to my country? And on the flip side, how can we collectively incentivize governments to look at different methods of procurement? For example, you mentioned cleaner use of materials, better use of more innovative, lower carbon impact power sources, whether it be renewable energy. But we see the same in terms of this discussion around efficiency of post-harvest handling, for example, which is a topic dear to my heart. And I know within Unilever, standards of food safety has been a huge issue in Africa, not to mention standardization of production. Carlos, you mentioned agro-processing. This is something which we have all seen, fits and spurts of investments, right? We see investors come in, fantastic announcements, $20 million investment in a rice initiative here, $1 billion poultry initiative there. And then it loses steam. People get frustrated with lack of integrated markets, lack of standards, a lack of implementation of agreements, non-tariff barriers. We've seen, you talked about corruption, Carlos, and I was happy to hear you mention the C word. I used to publish a report several years ago about bribes and delays in West African road corridors. And I was told in no uncertain terms that we shouldn't use the B word. But in fact, it was delaying products from getting efficiently to markets, and it was frustrating investors, and not to mention the users of the drivers and so forth. So with these macroeconomic structural challenges, and with the UN Food System Summit that you're both talking about in terms of how do we really envision a future quickly now, where we know that climate change is upon us, we know this is going to have a risk to all businesses and governments and populations. So what are you doing if you are CEO of Unilever again, starting today, Paul? And I know you're not supposed to say anything like that, but if you could, at a macro global scale, as a large corporation, find a way to address some of these issues, what would be steps 1, 2, 3? How do we go about implementing some different approaches? Thank you. Over to you. You have to unmute, Paul. Sorry, technical difficulty.
It should work now. Thanks. There's a lot in your question, Vanessa, and thank Carlos again as well for his usual deep insights and his passion. He was a valuable member of the commission, and the report is still very actively used globally. So I'm glad that we're together on the Zoom again and seeing Carlos in good health. But I think the question you ask is basically related to use, as well as what I would be doing if I would be in a position like a CEO in Unilever, which I was for 10 years. But I think that same answer I would give in the current position that I'm in. The first thing that is most important, and that is why we're talking in this conference, to look at our food and land use systems. And as the probably biggest opportunity that Africa has is something that is an imperative to me. Half of the world's young will be there. The food system now is entirely broken in Africa, even more so, I believe. You're using the whole time cashew and cocoa, but only less than 5% of its total value stays on the continent. Even the cashews are being shipped from the Ivory Coast or wherever to Israel, who then brands them and sells them with added value. Our food system in Africa really needs to change. And we have very low-hanging fruits in fixing supply chains, in working yield, in bringing technology and financial services. Actually, we know what we need to do. But if we can put the right people together across that value chain, I think we can make bigger and faster changes than currently, unfortunately, is the case. Then the most important thing there that I would fight for is obviously building an enabling environment. That's very much ingrained in the Sustainable Development Goals as well. If we don't do capacity building or have transparency or be able to enforce compliance, it's not going to work. Sometimes you feel you do one step forwards and 2 steps backwards. And there we need to have a joint effort, not a showing and telling, but a joint effort to constructively build that capacity. I remember working with Mrs. Sirleaf when I was at the high-level panel to develop the Sustainable Development Goals, and she was one of the co-chairs. And there was one person there that had a degree from the University of Wisconsin who became the Minister of Agriculture, but she didn't have any tools or capabilities around her. So as a CEO, I immediately put resources available to help her. We need to be all responsible for building that capacity. The second thing we need to do is build the capital markets and the financial flow. These things don't just come in for free. It's an underfunded continent. We even have a hard time, as I said, postponing debt. Some countries are having higher payments in debt service than they even are able to spend on their total healthcare systems. We need to wake up and have core responsibility to put the right financial, local banks, capital markets in place. And then data. There's a lot of opportunity now to have the data. Many of the decisions that we're taking were a little bit swimming blind, and getting the right transparency and data systems is important. On finance, sorry to come back at that, the wonderful opportunities we have now is blended financing. Only about 15% is what Africa receives in blended financing by memory to drive sustainable land use. I mean, this is the most important thing, to be able to have the minimum dignity and respect to feed our people, to be self-sufficient in agriculture. So we need to wake up to that reality around capacity building, around financial flows, and around data transparency. Now, one sentence on the youth that you started with. If I would have a message for the youth in Africa, well, you're lucky that you are young, because this is a wonderful world to be born in. More possibilities than ever, longer lives than ever, more access to things than ever before. This is the time to do it. You're on a continent that is going to be half the youth. You are probably one of the most innovative group of people together. There are more innovations coming from Africa than any other continent. You're also incredibly strong, developing, despite sometimes the odds, your social enterprises and creative solutions to the challenges that you deal with. And I've said many times, for the young in this world, it really is Africa time right now.
Beautiful. I think that's fantastic. So the audience is sending a few questions, and I'm going to try and take a look at those questions while we continue with one more question to you, Carlos. And this is my question to you. We have many really willing and able ministers of agriculture, and many of them struggle to, I think, communicate in an effective way their visions towards the ministries of finance within their own governments, and to elevate the messages towards a kind of a united government engagement. And what we've been trying to do within the African Green Revolution Forum Summit discussion is escalate and elevate the ability to message and communicate these flagships and these necessary changes, which are happening, and diligent work which is happening in all of these countries that we're actually in Africa, and discussing with. What from what you've been doing within UNECA and other platforms, as you're advocating as well for financial improvements and better use of development resources, because I know that you're very concerned that there be the proper use of resources for development, but also self-generated incomes, as you've described, through taxation. So how do you recommend and encourage steps that governments can make which will move the needle in a significant way, and really prioritize the changes which can and need to occur? And I know that you've worked through this in several countries in different periods. And to Paul's point, you know, in agriculture, processing staple crops and getting increasing nutritional value of what every African is eating is just as critical as the trade elements that we've been talking about. And I know this is kind of part of the equation that every Ministry of Agriculture is struggling with, because what we're talking about is balancing the subsistence farming with surplus, which can be actually traded and processed as you've described, and then the seasonality, which you described, which is a terrible cost actually to all these economies. So how do these governments that are willing and trying and struggling themselves, I think, to prioritize really tight budgets, how do they make their pitch? We've had some throughout the week making investment pitches, which I thought were going quite well, and I don't know if you had a chance to listen to some of them. Just before this call, I listened to Burkina and Mali, who really have made great strides in bringing together, a clear message about potentials for investment in poultry sector and rice sectors. There was a fantastic presentation by the Malawi government as well earlier. So over to you, Carlos. I've asked about 10 questions for the price of one.
No, thank you. Well, you know, the debate about trade is a very important focus right now in the continent for the right reasons. But we have to understand that achieving development through trade is just, you know, one of the various possibilities. Very often, the debate on trade is about treating trade as an end on its own rather than a means towards development. That's why we had the Doha Round, and what we got from the World Trade Organization Doha Round was just, you know, an approval of the principles, but no implementation. And we have been discussing implementation for the last 16 years without any success so far. So the continental free trade area in Africa is a response to that lack of progress. It's sort of a realization that unless we do it for ourselves, let's not count too much on this multilateral front. And this is also true for other systemic issues we are facing. For instance, development aid, including concessional loans from international financial institutions. This is a very important input into our development trajectory. But what people normally don't realize is that since the year 2000 until now, Africa's GDP has doubled. Did we have a double of development aid, including concessional loans during the same period? Of course not. There was more or less a stabilization around 50 billion insofar as Africa is concerned. It's about 30 billion. And that's it, which means that in terms of its weight in GDP terms, it has gone down by about half. So which means that African countries will have to borrow somewhere else just to keep the same level of oxygen to their economies that they used to have before, and that is no longer available through concessional loans. And what happens is that we have the least financed economies in the world. The public debt in Africa is the lowest in the world. This is what people don't say, that, you know, our GDP debt ratio is lower than any other part of the world. But it looks like it's a big problem here because we don't have money to service the debt properly, as Paul was just mentioning. Obviously, this is a problem of taxation. And this is a problem of not using properly our internal resources so as to negotiate better, because our deals are not good. We get into a situation where the paradox of the current world, and this is really phenomenal, is that we talk about loans to Africa that need to be concessional, but all that is available in terms of the amounts they need is actually commercial debt that can be Chinese, if you want to go midway, 3-4%, or all the way to 6-7% if it is commercial, when in fact the stimulus packages that have been put together after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and now further enhanced by this current pandemic crisis, do get the interest rates for the richest economies all the way down to zero or even negative yields. So which means that they have concessional. The rich countries have concessional loans, not Africa. So, you know, it doesn't really matter if we keep discussing that it is unfair. It is unfair. That it is unjust. It is unjust. What are we going to do about it? And this is where the taxation, the pension funds, and all the other resources come in order for us to transform our reality, our economic structure. And, you know, I must say that if you look into just the growth perspective, which is very partial, the forecast of the IMF in January this year was saying that 21 countries in Africa were going to have growth of 5% or more. Of course, this has been disrupted by COVID, but this was the projection. Now, what does that projection tell us? That projection tells us that about half of the population of the continent was supposed to be living in countries growing 5% or more. This is unprecedented. It never happened before in the continent, and it has never, you know, been matched in any other region of the world with the same number of countries involved. So we should give a bit of credit to the progress that Africans have made. But this, again, just tells us that we have two groups of countries in Africa. We have transformers and we have rent seekers, because most of the transformers are actually the ones that are not exporting a lot of commodities. The commodity-rich ones are performing poorly. And it was the ones that transform that are actually performing better, because they have realized they need structural transformation. They need to change the economic tissue that is going to constitute the basis of their new adaptation to the megatrends: demographic, technological, and climate. Now, I go to your question about leadership. If you really want to have transformative countries, and you need transformative leadership. And what is transformative leadership in practical terms, in public policy, nowadays in Africa? Is basically three ingredients. Countries have to be ambitious, they have to be sophisticated, and they have to be coherent. And let me now just qualify each one of those. Being ambitious is about being able to integrate the mega trends, being able to know how your demographics are going to influence your choices, how technology is going to change and disrupt a lot of sectors, and you have to embrace it, and how climate is going to actually put a stop in a lot of your hopes, because it's already in Africa. We just saw the locust invasion in East Africa, but the floods in East Africa as well, floods in Nigeria, floods in a country like Mozambique. And then you have, 4 years of drought in most of the countries in Southern Africa. So not to mention the Sahel, that is already a distressed area. So we know that these megatrends are there, and we need to be ambitious and embrace and have policies that respond to these challenges. Then we need to be sophisticated. We are not alone in the world. And we need to negotiate better. We need to exercise agency. We need to make sure that we choose our value chains very carefully. We need to construct our regional value chains. And countries that are small need to focus. They cannot do everything. They have to do one or two things. Then brings us to coherence. The time where, industrialization, which I proclaim is a necessity if it is properly done in a green way. Industrialization being done by the Ministry of Industry, give me a break. It will never happen. This is not about sectoral policies being piled up one after another. That's why when you discuss CADEP, which is the framework for Africa's agriculture, it's the business of the Minister of Agriculture. The rest of the cabinet looks the other way. It's not going to happen. So the only way these things happen is when you have very few set of priorities at the national level, and then you align your machinery, not just public, but also your economic actors in the private sector, to respond to that challenge. And countries that do this, and some are doing, they are growing, and they are growing in a more sustainable way. But of course, this is not easy. And it's for a lot of the elites in Africa that happen to be in countries with commodities that are important. They believe that their hopes are completely in how those commodities can generate rent, so they just leave some lavishly out of that rent.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for reminding us of the need for the integrated and strategic approach of the governments. And I think we've seen that in a few cases. It reminds me of the Kenya government's Big Four, which, if you can keep it on one hand, I always say with my kids, at least you know how to keep track. And agriculture, when agriculture made it into the Big Four for Kenya, I think that really opened a lot of eyes and enabled some flagships, enabled a really integrated approach. So we have to switch to our second segment, and I would reiterate that Paul and Carlos, you're welcome to stay and join the conversation. I know how fantastic of a panel this is, and I can't say that I'm sorry we have fewer than planned, because I can't imagine having heard less from both of you and your vision and your leadership, Paul. There was one of the questions from the audience, which is going to segue us into our next conversation, which was, who are these 27 companies that you're talking about with Imagine, and what are they doing. And thankfully, one of them is going to be our next speaker, Eric. So the burden of the question to Paul is coming your way. I'm just preparing you in advance, not that you need any preparation whatsoever. So
you have a great leader there with Eric, who has his heart in Africa. He was born on the wrong continent.
We're all learning from Paul.
No. You guys are
okay.
leading.
We hope to have free movement of people in the near future and multiple passports, so we can revisit our birth nations and locations. And anyway, much thanks, Paul, for taking the time, and Carlos, again, you've reminded us of the fundamentals, which are so critical: ambition, sophistication, and coherence. I think my husband will appreciate that you've given me a little bit of direction as well. So I'll remind him that you've given us guidance for leadership, which is really wonderful. So with that, I'm going to move to our second segment and introduce our three panelists in the second segment. Now, I just want to come back to the topic of Feed the Cities, Grow the Continent for this week. And we've framed this conversation on markets and trade relative to this topic of feeding the cities and growing the continent. And we've had a lot of questions come out about cities. What size cities? What are we talking about? It's not just Lagos and Nairobi and Johannesburg that we're talking about. We're talking about small cities. We're talking about Kaduna, right, Sadiq? We're talking about Kuchiala in Mali. We're talking about, I'm naming my favorite cities, so I'm giving myself away, maybe Segu in Ethiopia. There are really burgeoning mid-sized cities around the continent, and really the challenge that we've all been working together on for many of us have been linking the farmers in rural Africa to these smaller cities, to aggregators, and then from these aggregation points to larger processing centers. And so this would be my roundabout way of introducing first Sadiq Usman from Flour Mills, Nigeria. And I want to start with you, Sadiq, because you can really, I think, describe to us from your own personal experience on a global level and coming back to the heart of the agricultural transformation question in Nigeria at a time where Nigeria is really trying to feed itself, right? And to find ways for the private sector to really take a much bigger role in a sustainable agricultural and productive sector. And so maybe you can just give us a few of the insights you've gained in light of COVID as well, how that these have brought, you know, the inherent challenges you deal with into a whole another level of risk and opportunity. So over to you, Sadiq.
Well, thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you to the esteemed panel. Hello, Eric. Good to connect with you again. I think Carlos and Paul blew me away completely. So I've just been listening. I never thought it will come around to us. I thought we could allow them to keep on talking forever, actually. But well, thank you very much, Vanessa. I think, you know, you have quite a loaded question. So, and lot to break down. So if I may sort of break it down into three components, right, that I can chew. One is, you know, the issue of connecting rural agriculture to the urban consumer, right? And maybe how we grow markets, how these mid-sized cities such as Kaduna or, you know, Jos are going to become the next mega cities, which they're projected to become, right? And the third is maybe a very topical issue, certainly in Nigeria, helping Africans feed Africa, or helping Nigerians feed Nigeria, certainly. And then to link that to what we do, the company that I'm privileged to work for, our motto is feeding the nation every day, which is what we try and do when we wake up every morning. So just taking this sort of three themes, you know, separately, and hopefully try and put it all together. You know, very good comments, foundational comments made by Professor Lopez around the need to link agriculture with industry. And our surest path, as most African countries, I would assume, would be to link agriculture to industry. If we do not do that, our path to industrialization is uncertain, in my view. And in doing that, we need to do that through a value chain approach. That is always not very apparent. I think there's a lot of rhetoric around linking agriculture to industry, but it's not really always backed up by a value chain approach. Then secondly, something I know Vanessa holds very dear to her heart is the issue of the smallholder farmer in that context. And I saw, you know, one of the questions that has come through is, are we going to achieve that transformation in Africa with the smallholder farmer at the center of that relationship? I think that's a very interesting debate that we could have. My view is, whether we like it or not, today, the smallholder farmer is at the center of that debate. And in the absence of moving that smallholder farmer that form in parts of Nigeria, 98% of our production, then without moving them to alternative industries, and that requires retraining, education, and all manner of things, we have to improve the productivity of that smallholder farmer and link them to bigger value chains such as the ones we're involved in today, whether it's edible oil, sugarcane, you know, the grains, animal feed, starches, and such. The second issue, I think, is the issue of the growth of market and building a consumer class. You know, healthy and nutritious food, and looking into and tap into the opportunities that presents. There's a very delicate question there about what kind of food are we really producing, right? Who are we really trying to serve? What's the consumer of tomorrow? I call it, what we're increasingly seeing in Nigeria, I think, is called the sachetization of the economy. I call it a sachetization because we're moving from SKU units that are normal in many other countries, certainly in the West, to these very small sachets because of the affordability issue of the consumer. But are we going to build sustainable businesses on the back of that? And I think it's the same thing, and even with inputs now, and I'm sure Eric will speak about that, in terms of SKUs and units, whether it's for crop protection or fertilizer. We're having to increasingly, you know, go down to much more units to be able to serve that consumer on the backward side. Same thing on the downstream side. So lots of, I think, interesting discussions to be had on that. The last, and certainly not the least, is helping Africans feed Africa. And under that, there's some very interesting themes, I think, about value addition, as I've spoken about already, and improving the productivity and profitability of the smallholder farmer. There's the issue of backward integration, and that is extremely topical in Nigeria. The issue of the policies around the issue of the political direction towards backward integration, the issues of exchange rates, FX availability, which is very topical in Nigeria, and what should drive backward integration, whether it should be policy driven, incentive driven, whether it should be by fiat, you know, and what works. And also, more importantly, I think something that's always lost in the conversation about backward integration is, what should we be backwardly integrating on? Because, you know, interesting comments by Paul about rice. You know, we all want to feed ourselves and grow more rice, but is that the best use of our farmland? I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. You know, should we be growing more cashews rather than rice? Is that the best use of our farmland? Is that the best source of foreign exchange for us. If we're simply to feed ourselves, if we have trade-offs to be made, because we only have so much irrigated land, we only have so much land, which we're not utilizing very effectively today. So I think that's and lastly, but certainly not the least, is the issue of trade facilitation. Issues of smuggling come into that. The time it takes for things to clear at the ports, the difficulties in doing business at, at the ports, such as we who are based at the port in Apapa. It took me almost 2 hours to get into work, what should be a 15-minute journey this morning. So
you had to have customs documents to get to work, huh? Great. So I think you've given us about 4 lasts, but it's a phenomenal list of tackling the real trade-offs. And I'm glad you brought up the smuggling and port issues and the inherent challenges of what you're calling backward integration. And I think others have called last mile delivery as well, right? And it's 2 ways of looking at the same coin. But I wanted to come back to your comment about sachetization, which is so interesting. And there's been this conversation that I've been having with Dr. Kalibata as well around vegetable oils, which you brought up. And this is one of the visions which in a lot of countries have been struggling with local production of vegetable oil rather than imported, cheaper palm oil, for example, which is definitely far from nutritious in the fractionated, status that it comes in. And so, and I love the hard business talk because your question is very important. In the US, the market moved towards supersizing everything, and in Africa it's about sachetizing. It's knowing who your consumers are, right, and the size of packets. We even talked about this with Eric and the colleagues on the Farm to Market Alliance about the seed pack sizes, right, reducing sizes of seeds and fertilizers to meet the affordability, not about land but affordability. What can you pay for? And then making consumer goods and foods also, as you mentioned, more nutritious, but optimizing land utilization and the challenges inherent in foreign currency. And I hope, Eric, I'm sorry, you don't mind, but I'm going to let Alec jump in here and let you give us a big drum roll to wrap it up at the end. But Alec, where to invest, right? This is your daily burden. How do you make investments compliant, sustainable, and impactful, right? And this is maybe what is a fantastic and challenge that you've dealt with across the continent. Can you share with us some examples of where you've seen opportunities and these trade-offs really come to fruition in your experience? Which countries have taken leading positions, and what recommendations do you have in this conversation? So over to you, to Alec.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to join everyone today. I'm sorry I'm not in Kigali. We've got some great businesses we work with in Rwanda, and I'm looking forward to coming back soon. So just a little bit of background on AgDevco. We're an impact investor who work specifically in the agricultural value chain space in Africa. We've been doing that for around 10 years. So that's our kind of specialist area. And we sit in the investment space of about 2 to 10 million space. So I think we probably play a really important role in helping facilitate links between smallholder farmer production and some of the big business things that Paul was talking about as well, and these big corporates. And it's not an easy space to operate in. It's quite challenging in terms of finding bankable deals. So we're a commercial investor who's looking to build sustainable businesses which can then move on in future and grow and be self-sustaining, self-funding, and attract more finance and grow, and ultimately hopefully be transformative. So building value chains, creating jobs and livelihoods. And it's not always straightforward. So I thought I'd maybe pick up on some of the key areas of challenges that we've seen around our investment portfolio, and maybe that can then help come out in the discussion a little bit. So, and these are by no means comprehensive, but they're just some of the things talking with our investment team that really jump out. So we talked about the informal nature of the market earlier on. And that's interesting because it can really help deliver impact. You know, we can start getting money into the pockets of some of the people who are really far down the value chain. And that's very important in terms of improving livelihoods, but it's also a real challenge in terms of managing food quality and safety, in terms of doing efficient logistics, in terms of building brands. So there are pros and cons in there, but there's definitely scope for some increased formalization in parts of the market, which would really help an investor like us actually work better with the value chain. Stability in the operating environment, and this is it's not necessarily the role of a private sector investor like us to really influence kind of state policy and regional policy, but we need to operate within that, and we really benefit from a stable environment. Agriculture is a high risk and complex area to operate in anyway, whether it's climate driven, disease, other challenges like that. So there can be quite a lot of volatility just from what we're doing. So if we can have a stable operating trade regime, easy movement across borders, stable tariff situations and things like that.
Alec, are you talking about Africa still? I'm just wondering, can you come to Africa and tell us what you're seeing here?
Well, this isn't always the case, but it's something that would certainly help us, you know, in terms of managing seasonal working capital facilities and things like that. You know, a company needs to be able to be sure it can get its inputs to process them and then sell and export them. And if there are interferences in that, it can provide real challenges for important businesses that are providing basic foodstuffs and helping feed the urban populations that we're talking about. And that's particularly important for low margin businesses, which are hard to invest in, but are important to feeding the continent. And that's the real challenge area for investment. Commonality of standards is something that would be that would be helpful. I mean, Eric will probably speak to this a bit, but we have pest challenges in tree crops, for example, and we have a formulation which may really work really effectively. And we can apply that in Tanzania, but we can't apply that in Mozambique because it's not approved in the same way. If we knew that we could rapidly deploy an effective chemical that can prevent wastage, improve the production on, you know, full armyworm might be an example where there was a rapid need to respond to something. That sort of rapid response and ease of common standards would be very helpful in facilitating trade, as would kind of standards on, you know, a common aflatoxin standard, so that we knew that we were always working to the same kind of percent level rather than 20 somewhere and 4 somewhere else. So I think there's definitely some interest there. One of the key challenges, and this is not interesting, I guess, but I was talking about this when I was doing infrastructure conferences in Africa 10 years ago, but logistics is still a huge challenge for us, you know, hinterland connectivity, whether you're talking about the cold chain, whether you're talking about reliable power, or good roads, which mean that there's reduced wastage and damage of your production. So kind of that post-harvest loss getting between production and the market is a big thing for us. And then those expert logistics companies that can manage a cold chain business fast and effectively to take our product would be hugely transformative. There's a gap there. So what we find is a lot of businesses actually have to integrate themselves into becoming logistics companies. So we have someone who's on in terms of branding a day-old chicks company, but actually really they're a logistics company because they need to move those day-old chicks quickly to the market. And that might be the same, you know, for a number of other companies that we work with. So there's a big piece that's ongoing there about, you know, consistent power, about good logistics, about infrastructure, and of course, efficient borders and being able to get things out when we're talking about export markets effectively or within the regions. And then if we're talking about the real startup challenging projects where it's very hard for investment to happen, but in terms of greenfield development, this is hard to get capital into in the first place, but there's a lot of scope for local government and national government to help support that process in terms of things like making sure that there's power or a road network, or helping do those negotiations to get a fair land deal, both for the communities in the area, but also to allow the investor to move forward. And there's a big role for local government to help support businesses who are trying to do the best thing, but have a lot to do, which is a big drain on quite a tight financial model as you go into a business. So there's a piece there about support, and that also extends out to, we were talking about blended finance before. If we want to build sustainable commercial organizations, they need to be able to stand on their own feet. But there's a piece there about a helping hand from technical assistance, partnership with NGOs, with government agencies, and with technical assistance facilities from investors to help build up that capacity that we're talking about, to help drive these programs with smallholder supply chains about improving yield, which is hugely important in terms of this land pressure that we're talking about before. So there's a few areas that I think are interesting.
I've run out of pages, Alec, on my notebook. That's a fantastic list, and really from an investment perspective, and some interesting insights for governments who are looking to incentivize private sector investment. And I think we've seen a huge growth in the interest and willingness of the governments that we are working with to see private investment come in. Sadik might want to come back to that when we come back around, but I think your comments about how to partner on greenfield and new investments and integrated supply chains, where I was talking to some poultry investors who are looking to invest, and they actually are envisioning becoming a logistics company just to get, as you mentioned, the cold chain linked animal feed, everything has to move through warehousing. So the challenge of logistics is somehow daunting, and yet I know we have some logistics companies online. We have private sector online listening. We actually surprisingly have more than 140 people online listening, and so I encourage you all to pipe in and give us your feedback and comments, and we'll try and address some of them as we continue to go forward, because this is so exciting. And I just want to say, Eric, that, for a global CEO, you are so available and engaged. How do you do it? I don't think your family must ever see you, because I see you often enough, and we're not even like near each other. So Eric Freewell is the CEO of Syngenta, and really, I think, a committed visionary. And so, Eric, could you demystify for us a bit what a global multinational sees in Africa in terms of sustainability opportunities, in terms of impact for smallholder farmers? I mean, you personally have had such an impact and a vision, I think, in globally integrating your own supply chains. And I think someone talked about the responsiveness to locusts, fall armyworm, floods. You've been on the front lines of trying to get the right chemicals to the right areas across Africa, not to mention seeds and improving nutritional available, vegetables and even potatoes to respond to different growth opportunities. So just let us believe that a CEO of a global company does care about Africa. How do you see this inherent asymmetry, and what do you suggest from where you sit, and all the different encouraging positive approaches that you've been a part of? Thanks. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Vanessa. And first of all, it's an honor to be here. I can just tell you that Africa is on the hearts of many of us in the global agriculture industry. In fact, I came to Syngenta because I was on a trip with my wife to Tanzania a number of years ago, visiting smallholder farmers. And we both came away from that just touched by the struggles that they encounter and the potential that they have for Africa to feed itself. And so on the way back, I was telling my wife that I had been in agriculture before. I then went into a water business, and I wanted to get back into agriculture. And shortly after, I get a call about the Syngenta role. And so she was all in also about me joining Syngenta, and just love being in agriculture. And not only is agriculture important for Africa, in Syngenta, Africa is important for Syngenta, but also we have a foundation, which I'm fortunate enough to chair. And that's totally focused on smallholders, and Africa is a huge part of that. So first message is Africa is on the hearts of many of us in the global agriculture industry. So we all see the potential business-wise, but we want to help now get Africa up and running to feed itself. Second point is we've all been involved in many discussions and many initiatives to try to help farmers in Africa for Africa to feed itself. And I think there's been a lot of frustration for all the reasons that we've talked about now. I know we've had the Farm to Market Alliance, which has been an input play with Yara, Rabobank, Bayer, Syngenta, trying to help farmers in Kenya and Tanzania and other countries get the inputs that they need to grow the right crops. The problem is we haven't really been connected to the downstream. It's been difficult to do that. So I was really, really thrilled. We were, I would say, as an industry, when Paul Pullman pulled this Imagine group together and said, you know, if we work together across the agriculture food value chain as CEOs of these companies, these global companies, can we together make a much bigger difference than we all are trying to do as individual companies dealing with parts of the value chain? And of course, we all said yes, and we would love to do that. And one of the initiatives that was launched out of this Imagine group was taking a look at Africa and what should we do in Africa. What we decided was, let's pick one country, start with one country, and we picked Kenya. Let's get a group of people that care about Kenya, that are involved in Kenya, both from a global standpoint, so global CEOs, agriculture and food CEOs that wanted to join, as well as local CEOs of agriculture and food companies, and the government, the Ministry of Agriculture. Pull a collaboration of key value chain players together that really want to get the system for the country working well. And then jointly set goals for which crop are we going to work on. We started with maize. How much demand can we create and have the demand creators in the room, the ones that need the product in the room, saying how much demand they'll pull from within the country from Kenya, and what type of suppliers, including smallholders. How do we make sure that we're creating the demand for the smallholders in Kenya? And then talk together very openly with people on the ground that know the situation in Kenya. What are the issues? What's keeping us from being able to meet this demand within Kenya? What do we need to take action on? And we talked about things like aflatoxin, post-harvest storage that need to be able to dry the corn and keep it without aflatoxin, but address aflatoxin on the farm also. We talked about locusts and fall armyworm. How do we make sure we've got the products on the ground in packages that the farmers can access? How do we make sure that there's the financing and the agronomic advice services so that they're linked to the inputs so that the farmers can grow the right volume and the right quality? But you link all the way from the farmer and how we support the farmer all the way to the demand. And I'll tell you, that's made all the difference. Now we've only been doing this for a short period, but we can feel both on the ground and globally that our global support seems to be taking hold, and the local capability is pulling together to make, I think, what will be a real difference. And if we can prove that this model works, obviously we'll be glad to do it in other African countries very quickly.
Thank you so much. I think that's very concrete, very specific, and enables us to envision what many people don't believe is really possible, which is a collaborative, partnership-minded approach where different companies who have specializations use their strategic expertise, but bring those together to have a kind of an integrated approach and platform to addressing both the supply chain and logistical challenges, which Alec described so effectively for us, and also the standards issues that were raised earlier in the conversations with Carlos and Paul. But I think also, the climate change impact is one of the ones which everybody is looking at, again, still, as how do you measure, for example, an improved reduction of carbon or carbon sequestration? And to Sadiq, your point earlier, how do we know that we're optimizing land utilization while not excluding households from being productive with whatever they can in terms of using their land in perhaps a more diversified and sustainable way? And so there are these trade-offs that require constant digital big data analytics to come through and be available to kind of everybody at the right time. And this is something that global corporations who are trading and global prices, live and die by having the right data at their fingertips to make decisions. And yet on the ground, Sadiq, you and I have had these conversations about using digital in a way where farmers and distributors, right, can know, for example, how much fertilizer or seed to deliver to what town and what village at what time, so that you don't have an under delivery, over delivery in areas where information is really so limited. So, and Sadiq, you also have struggled, I know, in trying to deliver animal feed, which is at a competitive price, right? And this equation of competitive pricing versus imports, where you could be much more cost effective importing animal feed, I think, than buying locally. So Sadiq, what do you think, if there's a couple takeaways for this week and commitments that, let's say you want to convince Eric and the Imagine crowd to come to Nigeria next, what's going on locally that you think can happen with the global community, the investment community, and Alex, mobilization at AgDevco, where he's looking for political stability and in integrated logistics supply chain. So what's your pitch? Let's hear it.
Well, I think today, maybe off the top of my head, there exist two opportunities based on, speaking to Eric and here. One opportunity clearly around, I think, the input space. There is a lot of opportunity, I feel, for customization. I think the environment is very ripe. There's been a lot of focus in terms of building, soil maps, more focus on fertilizer, certainly availability, and price point, which I don't think is the issue in the fertilizer space. I think availability is a much bigger issue, especially as we're going through the peak season now in Nigeria. There's the issue on crop protection, which Eric knows well, on adulteration, quality, making sure we've got the right quality there. And I feel of these challenges can be addressed using technology, and using successful models of input delivery from other countries that we've learned. So I think that's the opportunity for Eric. And for Martin, on the ag dev space, I think there's a tremendous opportunity with the big focus on backward integration, domestication of raw material supply chains. There's a big opportunity, I feel, for value chain managers. Sorry, there's an alarm. There's a big opportunity for value chain development, I feel.
I hope you don't have a fire in the building.
No, not within the building.
Okay, we
I'm
just
at
checked.
the port, remember? Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of opportunity, as I was saying, for value chain development. And I think that skill set is largely missing. I saw one of the questions come through from Joe in terms of the trade-offs. I don't think there are really trade-offs. I think there's too many layers, as Vanessa knows, in many value chains between the producer and the farmer. And there's too many layers that are not value adding. They're just middlemen that are trying to take advantage or address informational asymmetry and informational or infrastructural deficits that exist. And I think with the focus that there is increasingly on many value chains, that is the opportunity to be able to, address that gap in between the processor and the farmer in providing better information, more linkages, especially as it relates to aggregation, and information the other way, whether it's weather information, whether it's input availability information, or even the consumer information. So I think those are the two opportunities that I see in that space.
I'm happy we agree with each other. I don't have to disagree with you publicly. So the one thing that I've seen Nigeria grow significantly and that many other countries have been wanting to replicate is the poultry industry and rice. And both of those were very strategic. And as you mentioned, required significant investments, incentives, government facilitation, and we're seeing that vision, I think, and also encouragement, right? If Nigeria can increase substantially local production as has been done in these areas, why not then, take up the vegetable oils again, as you've described. Nigeria is one of the biggest sesame producers on the continent, for example, and 90% is being exported, right, for other countries. So, but this is what you've described. We don't have to grow what we eat. Let's optimize the land that we have, but make healthy vegetable oil available as well, right? And so sometimes it's about educating consumers, and I think you mentioned that, right? It's changing the vision of what consumers want to eat and can eat. So Alec, with your magic wand, what's your investment pipeline? You've got a couple deals that are going to transform a few countries up your sleeve. What's your vision, and can you give us a glimpse of what you think is coming next?
I'm not sure about transforming countries, but we're certainly involved in developing some really transformative value chains in some areas. We've done some great stuff in really helping stimulate the start of a kind of avocado value chain in Mozambique, which has led to a proliferation of other businesses. That's an export crop, obviously. So that's not necessarily having huge direct feeding the local population angle. But one of the things that's interesting about that is that some of the product that doesn't make the grade A export, but is perfectly safe and good to eat, can also be diverted into the local market. So there's something interesting there. And what we've seen is that we're moving away to the piece about smallholders is interesting, because you can quite rapidly move out of the definition of a smallholder in terms of the kind of monitoring and evaluation criteria. You don't need to have a particularly big plot of land or income to do that. And we're now seeing what we would call emergent farmers coming through the value chain, who then start employing people and building that kind of pyramid of value chain through some of the businesses that we've started. So that's something that's certainly been interesting around our avocado value chains and we're involved in that in Mozambique and in Tanzania as well. The piece about poultry was interesting. We're involved in Kigali, actually, with Azuma Chicken, who are a really interesting business, and they're looking at how you can get affordable protein into the market, whether that's rural or peri-urban, even growers who are not necessarily been traditional poultry rearers and have constraints around being able to feed, source good quality food, and also then to pay for that. And that's bringing in a breed called Sasso chickens, which are kind of scavengers. They're almost a cross between a commercial breed and a village chicken. And that can grow very, very efficiently and effectively. And that's starting to stimulate a really interesting value chain, which is not only delivering local important protein, but is also creating quite a lot of value to the downstream network that come from the day-old chicks, the agents, and then the end retailers and sellers, who can both consume some and sell some, and have an increase in their income as a result of that. whilst not necessarily having to completely deviate from their day job, as it were, or some of their other activities. So it can be a supplemental activity. So that's something that I'm quite excited about, and AgDevGo is quite excited about, to give you a bit of an idea. The piece about data that we're talking about is really interesting and really important. And AgDevGo has something called the Smallholder Development Unit, which is a kind of grant-based facility, which does a lot of work with our big smallholder supply chains with some of our businesses. And they've been involved in quite a lot of work looking at how technology can get into the hands of smallholders or into small groups of smallholders and start improving, whether it's payment systems or intelligence, market intelligence. But I think it's probably a fair observation to say there's a lot of these platforms around. And there are pros and cons to all of them. And there's a bit of a maze to actually know what's a really good one to go with, and how's it really going to help. And how do we make sure that there's good data in that system? You know, not only is there a platform, but the data is good. And that's a space where there's probably scope for partnership between commercial investors who have pretty limited scope to do research and testing and innovation, with maybe some of the philanthropic money or some of the blended cash, which can support actually getting some really helpful solutions out there, which we can then put out in a commercial context.
Thanks. I think you've hit on the tree crops question with your avocado. There was a question that came, I don't know if you can see these through the audience, about tree crops and, you know, how investment can have a patient capital for the 3 to 7 year you know, gestation period. That's not, gestation would be more for poultry, but anyway, incubation of tree crops, and avocado is a really good example where there has been a lot of growth. I think mango is another one. And it's one of these hybrids where there are both some commercial operations, small commercial farms, and then more outgrower schemes as well, right? So that's an interesting scenario. There's another question that I thought was interesting, which came in for Eric, about the lessons learned from China. You know, when you're operating at a global scale, and Africa, and I've seen many countries really learn and benefit from other countries. Vietnam is one, China, Brazil. They have gone through these you know, ag transformation experiences, and they've developed tools and approaches, and we've tried to leapfrog, right, that long growth process by bringing appropriate and relevant technology, and then also, as Sadiq would mentioned, was customizing, localizing, really making it, you know, owned locally. But I wonder, Eric, off the top of your head, or, you know, from your back pocket, if you have a few ideas of your observations in technology leapfrogging. I think you're working hard at this every day. So let us get a snapshot. What is Snapchat? I'm talking about my kids here again.
So we've dramatically grown our business in China. And the way we've been doing it is we've created something. You know, we sell seeds and crop protection products and nutritional and crop nutrition products in China for many, many years. We've brought all that together, and we've decided that what we had to do is we had to help farmers go from really old practices, really old chemistry, fertilizer, overuse, destroying the soils, to leapfrogging, both with agronomists and in-room classroom teaching, but also digital tools. And what we created were MAP centers. We call them MAP centers, Modern Agriculture Platform. So we just started this a little less than 3 years ago. We now have 276 MAP centers across China. And these MAP centers, we put them in different areas. So some are in rice growing areas, some are in potato growing areas, vegetables, tree fruits. And each one has agronomists that are expert in those crops. And we're able to teach the farmers what they should be growing, bring them modern seeds, modern fertilizer, modern crop protection. And by the way, they use massively less fertilizer, a whole lot less crop protection products. Their yields are much higher. And we bring the food companies that are going to buy those crops to the MAP centers to describe and set the standards of what they're looking for quality-wise. And so these farmers all of a sudden have higher yields, their soil is richer, the quality is higher, so they can sell their products for a higher price. And it quickly transforms things. And my point here isn't that Syngenta needs to do this in Africa. My point is we need to work together in Africa to combine this suite of needs for the farmers and the downstream that they can connect. And this is what we're trying to do in Kenya. We've got a lot of agri-entrepreneurs, young people, which, by the way, in China, when we do these map centers, young people want to come and work at them because it's really cool, because it's not just selling, fertilizer and pushing it, or pushing a crop protection product or a seed. It's bundling services. And one of the services we have, instead of selling crop protection by the bottle, we're selling drone spray services. So we actually protect your farm for you. And that's really cool to young entrepreneurs. So they want to join us. They want to be part of these map centers. They feel like, they're part of a small company with this map center, but they're supported by everything that Syngenta has. So I think in Africa, if we can think of how do we take these, there's lots of young entrepreneurs that want to get into agriculture, lots of digital companies with digital tools will make the modern inputs available. But if we can connect the value chain, then we can make it really cool to work in the agriculture space, help the farmers increase not only the productivity, but also the quality, but it has to be connected to the downstream. And you pull this together through collaborations, and you can transform the agriculture. But you also have to have the government in there. We've had the Ministry of Agriculture in China loves these map centers. So they go and advertise how great these map centers are, which helps farmers want to come to them. We need the governments of the countries in agriculture, in Africa, the agriculture ministries, to work with us to pull these things together.
I love that example, and for a lot of reasons. I think demonstration speaks so much louder than anything in agriculture. We've seen that, as you mentioned, village-based agripreneurs and advisors just bringing information much closer to farmers. But I think you're right. Without the market coming closer and also being on the same page about expectations, this is the real challenge. And this is where I wish we had 10 Sadiqs on this panel with us, because what Flour Mills Nigeria is trying to do is commendable, and it's hard work, and it's not easy, and it's probably the least profitable of your businesses to link inputs back to the smallholder farmer last mile delivery, all the way to animal feed, all the way to the markets. And I think that the example you described as well, Eric, bringing the Ministry of Agriculture into that private sector environment so that it's a harmonized conversation. Because what I do often see is maybe governments are feeling anxious that the private sector is directing farmers to do the wrong thing because they want them to buy their products, right? And don't you see that as a risk factor? So I just wanted to, Sadiq, can you talk about Kaduna? Just
one quick,
one
quick point. What Sadiq said before about there's way too many layers in the value chain. That's critically important. We've got to connect the downstream to the upstream, the input, the farmers to the demand much better, much more efficiently, so that you get the right signals. What does the market really want? And then also efficiency of you produce what the market really wants and you get it there. That's really, really important.
Before I let you off the hook, Eric, would you be willing to envision, this is a heavy investment that you've described that you've done in China. And I know that the challenge for many companies like yours is to see the payoff, right? The uptake. Is the commercial side going to absorb sufficient volume of business in order to justify that investment? And it's also kind of tied to this multi-year tree crop kind of thinking. Africa investments aren't, a 2-year turnaround with an amazing internal rate of return through the roof. It's a different model of investing, but I think it is more akin to a multi-year partnership investment. That's the way I try and see it. But do you see there, a sufficient commercial payoff in the coming years to continue investing from a commercial perspective alongside the great work, of course, of Syngenta Foundation?
Yes, you asked me why I spend so much time on Africa. It's two reasons. One is I really care about Africa and want to see Africa feed itself. I think it's critically important for the world. But secondly, with the population today and the growth in population and the fantastic farmland, the fantastic soils and weather, the opportunity, the business opportunity over the long term is tremendous. We have a reasonable business in Africa today that's growing okay, but the potential is so great for us that absolutely we're in countries where the agriculture ministry wants to work with industry, wants to work with the ag food industry, and the downstream wants to work with the upstream. We're absolutely willing to lean in, invest, and become part of the solution and bring the world's leading technologies. And we start with this, with our foundation, going into countries that we don't go into commercially to try to help lay the groundwork for this. Simon Winter, who's the director of our team, has lived in Africa, spent a lot of time in Africa, and tries really hard with his team to collaborate with others to plant the seeds and get things going. And then the company moves in when we can have that value chain connection.
That's fantastic, and your optimism around the growth and the market size is aligned to all of the data that was described in their first sequence earlier, and the goodwill, I think, and the partnerships that the governments that are participating, at least this week, have all been really forthright and interested in increasing the investment opportunities in ag, and really see that partnership going forward. So last words, just a quick round. We're almost out of time. Quick thoughts, integrated regional markets, food trade, all the challenges that we've talked about. You are each sending a message to the presidential panel tomorrow. What's your 1 minute pitch to the heads of state who will be on the last session tomorrow? What would you like them to hear or think about in terms of the opportunity for the ag sector to grow in an integrated and sustainable way? Let me start with you, Alec.
I think I'd share Eric's energy and enthusiasm. We're hugely confident about the future and very committed to it. So a bit of that helping hand about the facilitation to enable investment to happen, and some of the support in the areas that direct investors can't control themselves, but is that supporting infrastructure would go an awful long way to enabling that investment environment to succeed.
Excellent. So supporting infrastructure, helping hand. Eric, what's your appeal and suggestion, pitch to the presidential panel for tomorrow?
Terrific opportunity today. Global companies are willing to invest and bring the world's greatest agriculture technology. Two things that they can do across Africa. One is bring the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to life, the free trade area to life, make that happen. And two, as much as standards can be set, it was brought up before, across Africa, so that goods can move, but also that seeds can be approved, that crop protection products can be approved, that modern technologies can be approved, then we'll bring them to Africa much more readily, and they can go across Africa. And then you grow the right crops in the right country, and those crops can move across. And they should all embrace a dream of Africa feeding itself within a certain period of time. I don't care, pick 5 years, 10 years, set a goal and make it happen.
Well, thankfully, someone picked 2030 for us. So let's go with the 2030 deadline on the SDGs and rally around that. I'm going to pick your deadline for you. But I love that you brought in the seed and technology approvals and the integrated markets, and this is really a huge, much too complicated point, and there's a whole group that was doing a deep dive on that. But it is a trade issue and a market issue, and I'm glad you brought it up again. It's one thing to integrate on paper, it's another thing to implement those standards across every single country and make them not just into law, but in implementation. And so, Sadek, what's your pitch to the presidential panel for tomorrow?
Well, I think it's already been said by Erica. I think it's simple. There's tremendous opportunity on the table and off the table. It's interesting. I think in the discussion we haven't mentioned COVID-19 once, but which is interesting. But it presents a tremendous opportunity as well, not to do things differently. Let's try and do things differently. Let's try and reimagine the future. We've got 10 years. Vanessa has set us a target, 10 years, SDG 2. We've got to get there by 2030. So we need the roles to be clearly defined, right? Our leaders all across the continent need to understand their role is a facilitation role. They need to facilitate, and the private sector is ready, as you can see, not only from within Africa, but from all over the world to come to Africa and invest in Africa. So create the space, set the direction, and leave the rest to us.
I love it. Beautiful. That's set the direction and leave the rest to us. And, you know, this is so aligned. I didn't bring COVID into this because it was part of the earlier conversation, and the concept of building back better, do things differently. I agree with you. There's nothing like the moment, in the moment right now, to make the changes that we dream about for our children, for our families. And thank you all for this fantastic panel. I hope to see you in the near future. Thank you all. Congratulations. Excellent discussions.